You know, I happen to be a baby boomer, and let me tell you something about baby boomers. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Me and Ozzy Osbourne, well, we're like brothers from different mothers, frankly, as far as age goes. But anybody who grew up in that era, like me, had a magazine that they really loved reading. The magazine started out in 1952, and I think it's still around today. It's changed hands many, many times. I think it's owned now by Warner Brothers, Discovery, or whomever. But the magazine was called Mad Magazine. Yeah, Mad Magazine. Classic one. It was a bi-monthly magazine. That was the magazine that I read growing up. Now, other magazines came out like Cracked and some other ones, but Mad Magazine, that was the standard. Heck, by 1970, in the early 1970s, had a subscriber base of 2 million. But people like me, that's what we read. But one of my favorite strips in Mad Magazine, aside from Alfred E. Newman and What Me Worry, that was his standard catchphrase. Alfred E. Newman, What Me Worry. But one of my favorite strips was one called Spy versus Spy. There was a comic strip about two spies, one on one side, one on the other, and it represented the United States versus Russia, because back then we were in what is known as the Cold War. And the Cold War was us against them. And many things controlled the Cold War. I mean, remember the Berlin Wall that went up? All those things that happened. As far as MAD, mutually assured destruction, people responsible for that was the Strategic Air Command, the section of the United States Air Force that had all the B-52 bombers, the hydrogen bombs, the missiles. Yeah, that's where I flew. That was part of my career. But that was my favorite strip, Spy versus Spy. Now, the reason I tell you all this is because the U.S. and our enemies, call them whatever you want, we spy on each other. That's what we do. That's the way countries work. When a country has an election coming up, if we don't like who's running, we'll try to change the election. We've done that. CIA does this. Other agencies in other countries, we do it back and forth. So if you think we sit there, we're pristine, we ain't. We do the same stuff that other countries do. Now, how does that relate to what's going on today? Well, back in the 2016 election, and let's take you back that far, Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump. Okay, we all know that. And the consensus was, and everybody agreed that, man, Hillary's going to win this thing in a walk. She's going to clean the clock. And everybody believed that. Well, Russia, because they like to interfere with stuff just like we interfere with stuff on them, they said they start poking around in our computers and see what they could do, but realized they couldn't do anything. But we knew they were poking. We knew they were doing stuff. We knew they just couldn't get in and change stuff. Yeah, they bought some ads on Facebook or whatever. Didn't really change anything because they figured, hey, Hillary's a slam dunk. She's going to win. All right. So all this intelligence stuff going on between us and the Russians, but everybody else does intelligence also. We ain't the only country that does it. Well, as it turns out that Norway, they have an intelligence service. They were actually able to hack into the Russians' intelligence service, because they hack in ours, we hack into theirs. They hacked in and found something. They discovered that the Russians had hacked into the Democrats' DNC website. And they pulled out a treasure trove of stuff out of that website. Now, DNC knew they'd been hacked, but they didn't know what was taken. Well, it turns out the Norwegians said, hey, the Russians got all this stuff. So the Russians, well, they were upset about it, but Norway had the whole cache of information. So Norway comes back to the United States and said, hey, we found some cool stuff. Take a look at this. Well, that goes to our intelligence people. That's intelligence information. And they got it, and they learned stuff about Hillary that, apparently she'd had some medical problems, type 2 diabetic, was taking all sorts of medications, had big swing mood changes. You've seen some of that stuff, the problem of being helped to cars and some other stuff. But some big things, plus they said that she was power hungry. Okay, fine. Well, Russia learned all this stuff, and instead of saying, let's not try to, let's stand back and let the election happen because Hillary's going to win. And the Russians said, hey, we've got dirt on Hillary, so when she becomes president, we got stuff we can use on her to get her away. And that's what happened. Well, that information stayed in the intel service for the longest time, that the DNC had been hacked. Now, lately, you're starting to hear stuff. You're starting to hear that Tulsi Gabbard, as the head of the defense, the DNI, the old DNI, she's gone through this stuff and she's going, look at this stuff they found. Because none of this stuff had been buried. This particular information was in the highest, deepest safe that you could possibly do. This had the highest top secret stuff designation on it ever. Well, they found it in a place that nobody would normally look. Found the data in there about Hillary. Now, Russians had it. And that's who they were going to be backing up if she won, because that's what they figured she was going to win. They didn't realize that Donald Trump was going to win. Well, now Tulsi Gabbard's starting to bring this stuff out. So here's the stuff that's going on. And remember when Trump was out of office, that the government, FBI, CIA, whoever it was, raided his Mar-a-Lago complex looking for something? They were looking for something. Apparently, they were looking for that piece of data, that 5 pages or 2 pages of information that we'd gotten from Norway. All that information was what they'd hacked out of the DNC's computers. The Russians did. That's apparently what they were looking for. That's a guess, but I'm telling you, they were looking for something. Didn't find that because that was in another safe that nobody realized was there because it was so highly covered up. Well, Tulsi Gabbard has released it. And it's a big flurry, and people are all upset, claiming she's not qualified, she's the worst person in the whole world, but we're finding stuff out. Now, you can choose to believe whatever you want, but I believe what Norway came up with. I believe that Norway went and hacked into the Russians' computer and found out the Russians had hacked into the DNC computer. Spy versus spy. Now you understand why it's such a big thing. Folks, we all do it. We do it to other countries do it to us. But sometimes you find out a little nugget that comes in there and you go, whoa, we didn't know that. So if you're wondering what's going on, you're wondering all the hoopla about, well, now you're learning. The problem is how that information was used or not used. And now we're learning that maybe at the highest levels, some information, Russian dossiers that were fake were used. Changing narratives were used, because when Donald Trump got elected, there was so much angst and anger. You saw it. They said, we've got to take this guy down. We got to do whatever we got to do to take this guy down, make his life a living hell, and they did. First 2 years, remember the Mueller investigation? He really couldn't do anything. He was fighting everything off in the first term because that was the plan. Get him out, get him arrested, get him put in prison, whatever they could do. Didn't work. Now, yes, Biden got elected back in 2000 and 2020. Yeah, he got elected 81.5 million votes, largest in the history of America. Don't know how that happened, because later on, nobody's ever got that many votes in history after that, or even before that. But now, turns out the Justice Department has instituted what's called a strike force. They institute that for organized crime groups, big time groups, professional criminals. And they're looking into what's going on and what was done, and some bad stuff involving people in high ranking places who did some pretty awful stuff. Yes, it's spy versus spy, country versus country. But when it happens within a country, spy versus spy, when it comes to party versus party or tribe versus tribe, when we reach that level, ladies and gentlemen, we have got ourselves in a real big problem. And if that's the way things are going, that could be, well, it could be the demise of a lot of stuff, including the country we call America. That's the last thing we need, folks. We've had one civil war. We don't need two.